They blocked my driveway for a bigger house, so their new extension got bulldozed. How does blocking someone's driveway end with an entire home extension being bulldozed? What happened between those two moments? And how could a single construction project change everything? If stories like this keep you watching until the very end, subscribe and turn on notifications for more unforgettable neighborhood disputes. Before we begin, let me know in the comments. What would you do if someone blocked your only driveway while expanding their own house? The story starts on an ordinary morning when one unexpected sight outside my garage made me realize my quiet neighborhood was about to change in ways I never imagined. People don't realize a house can disappear long before anyone moves out. The first thing I heard that morning wasn't birds or traffic. It was the heavy rumble of a bulldozer idling at the edge of my neighbor's yard, followed by the sharp metallic clank of its blades settling against the ground. Diesel fumes drifted through the cool morning air, mixing with the smell of fresh-cut lumber and damp soil. I stood at the end of my driveway with a coffee growing cold in my hand as yellow caution tape fluttered gently between orange survey stakes. The county inspector adjusted his clipboard without saying a word, while two construction workers quietly waited for the signal to begin. My neighbor, Greg Harrison, looked frozen beside the oversized addition he had spent months building onto the side of his house. The morning sun reflected off brand-new windows that, in just a few minutes, would no longer overlook anything except an empty patch of dirt. For days earlier, Greg had stood in almost the exact same spot wearing that familiar confident smile. He crossed his arms, looked directly at me, and casually said, "You'll figure something out. I need the space more than you need that driveway." At the time, I didn't answer. Not because I agreed with him, and certainly not because I was intimidated. I stayed quiet because I had spent my entire professional life learning that arguments rarely solve property disputes. Measurements do. Records do. Signed documents do. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 43 years old, and I've worked as a civil engineer for nearly 2 decades. My job has taught me that concrete can hide mistakes, but it can never erase them. Every property has a history beneath the surface, even when no one notices it anymore. Every boundary tells a story. Every easement exists for a reason. Most people never think about those invisible lines until someone decides to build across them. Greg had moved into the neighborhood less than a year earlier. He wasn't the loudest neighbor I'd ever had, and he wasn't openly hostile. He simply carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from believing bigger always means better. Bigger trucks, bigger projects, bigger investments, bigger houses. Around here, most homes had been standing for decades, each with enough room to breathe. Greg looked at his lot and saw and used potential instead of carefully planned space. I looked at it and saw something entirely different. I saw a layout that had been designed with purpose long before either of us bought our homes. That quiet Tuesday morning, as the bulldozer's engine echoed through our normally peaceful neighborhood and a light breeze carried dust across the freshly graded yard, I realized the biggest mistake Greg ever made wasn't blocking my driveway. It was assuming the ground beneath his new extension belonged entirely to him. The driveway had never been impressive, and that was exactly why most people ignored it. It was a single strip of weathered concrete just wide enough for one pickup truck, stretching from the street to the detached garage behind my house. My father poured most of it himself almost 30 years ago with help from 2 neighbors and a rented concrete mixer. He used to joke that it was the straightest thing he had ever built because he measured everything twice before pouring a single inch. Even after all these years, the surface still carried faint marks from the wooden forms they had removed at the end of that long summer weekend. Every time I backed my truck into the garage, I remembered watching him kneel beside fresh concrete with a finishing trowel while I carried cold lemonade. Across the yard, after he passed away, I kept the house because it never felt like just another property. It felt like the place where every corner held a memory that could not be replaced. As a civil engineer, I appreciated something else most people overlooked. Neighborhoods like ours were designed carefully decades before the first families ever unpacked a moving box. Property lines, drainage routes, utility corridors, easements, setbacks, and access points all fit together like pieces of a puzzle. If one piece moved, every neighboring property could be affected in ways that were not obvious at first glance. That was why I never rushed into remodeling projects or ignored survey markers whenever I saw them appear nearby. Invisible lines mattered just as much as fences. Greg Harrison saw things differently from the day he moved into the house next door. His property was nearly identical to mine, but he constantly talked about making it larger. Every weekend seemed to bring another delivery truck loaded with building materials, stacks of lumber, pallets of concrete block, or bundles of roofing shingles. He liked telling anyone who would listen that expanding the house would add tremendous value and give him the dream home he deserved. The conversations usually ended with him pointing toward the narrow space between our houses and explaining how much extra room he planned to create. I listened politely, but I noticed something he never mentioned. Every sketch he described pushed the project closer to the side of my property. One Saturday morning, I watched a survey crew place bright orange stakes along the edge of his yard. They worked efficiently, took measurements, packed their equipment, and drove away before noon. A few hours later, Greg walked over carrying a rolled blueprint under one arm. He smiled like someone sharing exciting news with a friend instead of announcing a problem that would soon involve both of us. He said construction would begin within days and assured me everything had been approved. Then he casually glanced toward my driveway for several seconds before looking back at his plans. It was only a brief moment, but something about that quiet pause made me feel as though he was already picturing my property as part of his own project, and I could not shake the feeling that the lines my father respected for decades were about to be tested. Construction began the following Monday, just after 7 o'clock in the morning. I heard the backup alarms before I even finished pouring my first cup of coffee. By the time I stepped onto my back porch, 2 pickup trucks, a flatbed trailer, and a compact excavator had already filled the narrow space beside Greg's house. Men in reflective safety vests unloaded lumber, while another crew stretched bright string lines between wooden stakes. The steady rhythm of nail guns mixed with the rumble of diesel engines, replacing the quiet sounds our neighborhood usually woke up to. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Home improvement projects happened all the time, and I had no reason to believe this one would be different. Greg waved as if we were simply sharing another peaceful morning. He even smiled and said the project would be finished within a few weeks if the weather cooperated. I nodded politely, but my attention stayed on the layout the crew had established. Years of engineering had trained my eyes to notice proportions before anything else. The excavation seemed unusually close to the line separating our properties. The orange survey stakes I had noticed days earlier were now surrounded by freshly disturbed soil, and several temporary wooden forms extended farther than I expected. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Drawings often looked different once construction started, and appearances could be misleading without measurements. Over the next several days, however, each new stage pushed the work closer toward my driveway. The excavation became a concrete footing. The footing became a foundation wall. Delivery trucks parked along the curb for hours at a time, and stacks of framing lumber slowly narrowed the already limited space between our homes. I found myself easing my pickup truck through a tighter gap every evening, folding in my side mirror just to avoid brushing against construction materials. Greg never seemed concerned. In fact, the larger the project became, the more confident he appeared. One afternoon, he walked across the yard carrying a set of revised blueprints tucked beneath his arm. He pointed toward the framed edition with obvious pride and explained how the extra square footage would give him a larger family room, a home office, and enough storage to increase the value of his property. Then he glanced toward my driveway again and casually remarked that I probably would not need so much room to get in and out once everything was finished. His words were lighthearted, almost conversational, but something about them settled heavily in my mind. That evening, I parked inside my garage and stepped back outside to study the distance between the new framing and the edge of my driveway. It looked narrower than ever before. I measured it with a tape measure, then measured it again because I trusted numbers more than instincts. The results did not immediately prove anything illegal, but they confirmed one important fact. Every day the project moved forward, the margin for error grew smaller. Standing there beneath the fading evening sky, with the scent of freshly cut lumber drifting through the air and the unfinished frame casting long shadows across the concrete my father had poured decades earlier, I realized I needed to start paying attention to far more than what was visible above the ground. By the end of the second week, The construction site no longer felt like something happening next door. It felt like it had quietly crossed onto my daily routine. Every morning, I had to wait while concrete trucks squeezed into the narrow street, forcing me to delay leaving for work. Every evening, I carefully guided my pickup truck through an opening that seemed to shrink a little more each day. Fresh lumber leaned against temporary fencing only a few feet from the edge of my driveway, and piles of gravel occupied spaces that had always remained clear. The constant sound of compressors, circular saws, and reversing trucks echoed across the neighborhood from sunrise until late afternoon. The smell of wet concrete mixed with fresh paint and diesel exhaust settled over the block like a permanent reminder that the project was moving faster than anyone expected. Then came the morning everything changed. I opened my garage as usual, climbed into my truck, and shifted into reverse. Less than 3 feet behind my rear bumper stood a temporary chain-link construction fence that had not been there the night before. Beyond it, stacks of framing lumber and a portable cement mixer completely blocked the only path connecting my driveway to the street. I stopped the engine and walked outside, convinced there had been some misunderstanding. One of the workers politely explained that they had been instructed to keep the access closed while additional framing materials arrived later that morning. He apologized, but told me I would need to wait several hours before they could move anything. Before I could respond, Greg walked around the corner carrying a cup of coffee as though nothing unusual had happened. He looked at the blocked driveway, then looked at me with an expression that suggested the inconvenience was too small to discuss. I reminded him calmly that this was my only way to leave my property. He shrugged and said construction always caused temporary inconveniences. When I asked how long the obstruction would last, he answered that the schedule depended on the contractors, not him. I took a slow breath and asked whether he realized I could not even drive to work. He smiled in the same relaxed way he always did and delivered the sentence that stayed with me ever since. You will figure something out. I need the space more than you need that driveway. There was no anger in his voice. That almost made it worse. He genuinely believed expanding his house justified limiting access to mine. I looked past him toward the growing extension. Fresh wall framing now projected farther than I remembered, and new support beams cast long shadows across the narrow strip separating our properties. The project suddenly looked much larger than the approved sketches he had shown me weeks earlier. Instead of arguing, I quietly took several photographs from different angles, noting the position of the temporary fence, the construction materials, and the relationship between the new framing and my driveway. Then I measured the remaining clearance again and recorded every number in a notebook I kept inside my truck. Greg probably thought I had accepted the situation because I drove away only after the workers finally moved their equipment later that afternoon. What he could not see was that I had already stopped treating this as an argument between neighbors. From that moment forward, I started treating it as an engineering problem waiting to be documented. The next morning, I called the county building department before leaving for work. I explained the situation carefully, sticking to facts instead of frustration. I described the narrowing access, the temporary blockage, and my concern that the new addition might be extending farther than the approved plans allowed. The woman who answered transferred me to a building inspector, who listened patiently and agreed to schedule a site visit later that week. I felt cautiously optimistic. Even if nothing had officially crossed the line yet, at least there would be a record that concerns had been raised before construction reached its final stages. 3 days later, the inspector arrived just after 9 o'clock wearing a reflective vest and carrying a tablet loaded with permit records. Greg greeted him with an easy smile, shook his hand, and proudly walked him around the project before I even had a chance to introduce myself. I remained quiet while the inspector compared the visible construction to the digital permit documents on his screen. He measured several exterior walls, checked the permit number posted near the temporary fence, and asked the foreman a few routine questions about the progress of the addition. The entire inspection lasted less than 30 minutes. Finally, the inspector walked over to me and said something I had not expected to hear. Based on the approved permit and the information currently available, he did not see an obvious violation requiring an immediate stop work order. He explained that everything appeared consistent with the submitted plans and advised me to contact the department again if new evidence became available. Greg thanked him with a confident grin before the inspector even reached his truck. As soon as the county vehicle disappeared around the corner, Greg looked toward me with unmistakable satisfaction. He did not raise his voice or celebrate dramatically. Instead, he simply smiled and said, "Looks like everything is exactly where it is supposed to be." Then he turned and walked back toward the construction crew while the sound of pneumatic nail guns filled the air again. I stood beside my driveway longer than I realized, staring at the growing addition that seemed perfectly ordinary to everyone except me. For the first time since construction began, I questioned my own assumptions. Had I been too focused on appearances? Had years of engineering made me suspicious of problems that did not actually exist? That evening I spread every photograph I had taken across my dining room table. I compared images from the first survey stakes to the latest framing, zooming in on corners, measurements, and reference points. Nothing obvious explained why the structure felt wrong, yet the numbers I had recorded over the previous 2 weeks continued to bother me. They were small differences, almost insignificant by themselves, but engineering had taught me that major failures often began with tiny inconsistencies everyone else ignored. I walked into the garage just before sunset and found an old storage cabinet my father had built years ago. Inside were faded folders containing original paperwork for the house, maintenance receipts, utility sketches, and documents I had not looked at in years. I pulled the dusty box onto my workbench without knowing exactly what I hoped to find. I only knew one thing with complete certainty. If the ground beneath Greg's new addition carried a story older than his building permit, the answer would not be standing outside. It would be waiting somewhere inside those forgotten records. I spent nearly 4 hours inside my garage that evening with nothing but an old folding table, a desk lamp, and a stack of dusty file boxes my father had labeled decades earlier with neat black marker. Most of the folders contained ordinary records that every homeowner eventually forgets about, including appliance warranties, faded tax receipts, and handwritten maintenance notes. Then I found a thick envelope stamped with the name of the original subdivision developer. Inside were documents I had never paid much attention to before because I had never needed them. There was the original subdivision plat, a certified boundary survey, utility easement records, drainage plans, and several engineering sketches prepared before the neighborhood was even built. I carefully unfolded the largest drawing and spread it across the table. The paper had yellowed with age, but every line remained perfectly clear. Within minutes I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Running along the side of both properties was a recorded access and maintenance easement that extended several feet beyond the visible property line. It had been established years before either house existed to preserve permanent access for utilities, drainage, and emergency maintenance. That invisible strip of land explained why the homes had originally been positioned exactly where they were. It also explained why Greg's expanding addition had never looked right to me. The next morning, I contacted Michael Harper, a licensed land surveyor I had worked with on several municipal projects over the years. I trusted his judgment because he never guessed when measurements were involved. He arrived that afternoon carrying professional survey equipment, a tripod-mounted total station, and copies of the county parcel maps. Before taking a single measurement, he quietly reviewed the documents I had discovered. He looked at the recorded plat, then at the engineering drawings, and finally back toward the nearly completed addition. His expression changed from curiosity to concern without saying a word. For the next 2 hours, he measured every visible reference point, compared existing improvements with the recorded survey, and marked several locations with temporary paint and bright orange flags. I watched carefully while writing down every observation in my notebook. When he finally walked back toward me, he folded his measuring rod and spoke with the calm confidence that only comes from verified facts. He explained that the building permit itself was not necessarily the problem. The issue appeared to be that the approved construction had either been interpreted incorrectly in the field or had been built beyond the legal limits shown on the original recorded documents. More importantly, part of the new extension appeared to occupy protected easement space that should never have been obstructed by a permanent structure. Michael emphasized that his measurements would need to be documented formally before any conclusions could be presented to the county, but he was confident enough to recommend moving forward immediately. That single conversation changed everything. For the first time since construction began, I was no longer relying on instinct or memory. I had engineering records, certified measurements, and an experienced surveyor independently confirming that the story hidden beneath the concrete was very different from the one visible above it. As the evening sun reflected off the unfinished walls next door, I realized the most important part of this battle would not happen on my driveway. It would happen inside a file delivered to the county building department with every measurement supported, every document organized, and every inch accounted for. The report Michael prepared was as precise as I expected. Every page connected another piece of the puzzle until the entire picture became impossible to ignore. The certified survey compared the original subdivision plat with the current construction footprint, highlighted the recorded easement boundaries, and documented every measurement taken on site. He included photographs with reference markers, scale diagrams, and detailed notes explaining how the newly framed addition extended into protected access space that had existed long before either Greg or I owned our homes. There was no dramatic language anywhere in the report. There did not need to be. Facts presented clearly carried more weight than opinions ever could. I spent the next evening organizing everything into a single binder. The original property records my father had saved, Michael's certified survey, my own dated photographs showing the project from the first excavation through the latest framing, and the measurements I had recorded over the previous weeks all fit together in chronological order. Every page supported the next. Every photograph matched a survey point. Every observation could be traced back to an official document. Before submitting anything, I scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney recommended by a colleague. She reviewed the entire file without interruption, occasionally making notes in the margins before quietly closing the binder. Her conclusion was straightforward. The first inspection had focused on whether the visible construction appeared consistent with the active building permit. It had not included a detailed review of the historical subdivision records or a field verification of the recorded easement boundaries. She explained that building permits relied on accurate plans and proper field layout. But if either of those elements failed to match the legal property records, the county had the authority to require corrective action. She recommended submitting the complete package through the formal review process instead of relying on another informal complaint. That advice made perfect sense. The following morning, I delivered the binder to the county building department in person. The clerk carefully logged every document, attached my supporting photographs to the case file, and confirmed that the certified survey would require an official follow-up inspection. For the first time since this situation began, I left the county office feeling calm instead of frustrated. I had stopped trying to convince anyone with arguments. The documents would speak for themselves. Several days passed without visible changes at the construction site. Greg's contractors continued installing exterior sheathing and preparing the roof framing, while delivery trucks arrived almost every morning. Greg occasionally waved as though nothing unusual had happened, apparently confident that the first inspection had settled the matter permanently. I simply nodded and continued documenting the progress from my own property. Then, late one Thursday afternoon, I noticed a white county vehicle slowly turning onto our street. It was followed by another truck carrying professional surveying equipment. This time the inspection team was larger than before. The inspector stepped out holding a thick folder that looked remarkably similar to the binder I had submitted only days earlier. Michael arrived a few minutes later carrying his survey equipment once again. Bright orange reference flags soon appeared across the side yard. Laser instruments were carefully positioned on tripods, and fresh measurements began replacing assumptions. Watching them work with quiet precision, I realized the conversation had shifted completely. No one was debating opinions anymore. Every answer would come from the ground itself, measured 1 inch at a time. The second inspection unfolded very differently from the first. There were no quick visual checks or casual conversations beside the construction fence. This time the county inspector arrived carrying my submitted documentation, Michael's certified survey, and copies of the original subdivision records. Before anyone spoke about the addition itself, they established fixed reference points using the same survey monuments recorded decades earlier when the neighborhood had first been developed. Michael carefully positioned the total station while another survey technician verified every benchmark independently. Bright orange flags appeared one after another along the easement boundary, and thin colored strings stretched between survey stakes until invisible property lines became visible for everyone standing there. Greg remained confident during the first several minutes. occasionally explaining that his contractors had followed the approved plans from the building permit. The inspector listened without interrupting, making notes after every measurement. Then the numbers started coming together. Michael quietly compared each field measurement against the recorded plat, while the inspector reviewed the approved site plan beside him. Neither man raised his voice. They simply continued measuring, documenting, photographing, and checking dimensions one by one. I recognized that expression on Michael's face because I had seen it many times on engineering projects. It was the look someone wore when the data had already answered the question before anyone said it aloud. After nearly 2 hours, the inspector asked Greg to join us near the side of the addition where several orange flags marked the recorded easement. He explained that although the building permit itself had been issued based on the submitted plans, the completed field layout did not match the legal conditions established by the recorded subdivision documents. Whether the discrepancy resulted from an incorrect layout, an inaccurate interpretation, or construction extending beyond the approved location would require further administrative review. However, one fact had already been verified through certified measurements. A permanent portion of the new addition occupied protected easement space where no permanent structure could remain. Greg's confident expression disappeared almost instantly. He asked whether the issue could simply be resolved by adjusting paperwork or requesting another permit. The inspector calmly shook his head and explained that recorded easements could not be ignored through a standard permit revision because they protected long-standing access and utility rights affecting neighboring properties. He handed Greg 2 official documents. The first was a stop work order requiring all construction activity to cease immediately. The second required corrective action before the project could receive final approval. The construction crew quietly shut down compressors, stacked their tools, and began leaving the site one vehicle at a time. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood became strangely quiet. No backup alarms echoed across the street. No nail guns interrupted the afternoon. Only the sound of papers turning in the inspector's clipboard broke the silence. I remained standing beside my driveway, without saying a single word. There was nothing left to argue because every conclusion had come directly from documented measurements rather than personal opinions. As the county vehicles slowly pulled away and the temporary notices fluttered gently against the unfinished framing, I looked at the extension one more time. It still stood, exactly where it had that morning, but now everyone understood something Greg had never considered. Concrete, lumber, and fresh paint could make a building appear permanent, yet a structure built across the wrong line could lose that permanence with the stroke of a pen long before a single machine ever arrived. 4 days after the stop work order was posted, I woke before sunrise to a sound that instantly brought me back to the beginning of everything. The deep, steady rumble of a bulldozer echoed through the neighborhood as heavy equipment rolled slowly onto Greg's property under the supervision of county officials. The same side yard that had been crowded with stacks of lumber, fresh concrete, and confident construction crews now held survey flags, safety barriers, and a demolition schedule approved by the county. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. The workers simply unfolded their plans, confirmed measurements one final time, and began carrying out the corrective order exactly as written. The first section they removed was the portion extending into the recorded easement. Piece by piece, carefully and methodically, the addition that had taken weeks to build disappeared. Fresh framing was separated, roofing materials were lowered safely to the ground, and sections of the exterior wall were dismantled with remarkable precision. The bulldozer moved only when necessary, pushing away debris that had already been detached by the crew. Dust drifted slowly through the cool morning air, carrying the familiar scent of cut lumber instead of fresh construction. Greg stood quietly near the edge of his lawn, watching every step without interrupting the process. He no longer looked frustrated or defiant. He simply looked like someone realizing that assumptions could become very expensive when they ignored documents that had existed long before any construction began. Several neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, speaking softly as they watched the work unfold. Most of them had only seen the new addition growing larger each week. Very few had known the invisible history hidden beneath the property, the easement recorded decades earlier, or the engineering records that protected access long before our neighborhood became what it is today. By early afternoon, The portion occupying the protected easement had been completely removed. The county inspector walked the site once more with Michael Harper, comparing the corrected layout against the certified survey. After one final verification, he signed the compliance paperwork and removed the stop work notice. My driveway, which had gradually become narrower with every stage of Greg's project, finally opened back to the full width it had always been designed to provide. That evening, I backed my pickup truck out of the garage without folding my side mirror for the first time in weeks. The tires rolled smoothly across the same concrete my father had poured nearly 30 years earlier. I paused for a moment at the end of the driveway and looked back toward the quiet space where the oversized addition had once stood. Nothing looked dramatic anymore. The heavy equipment was gone. The workers had left. The survey flags had been collected. Only open space remained where permanent construction had briefly replaced invisible legal boundaries. As I shut off my engine, I thought about something my father used to tell me whenever we worked on projects together. He always said that the strongest foundation was never the concrete people could see. It was the planning underneath that nobody noticed until something went wrong. Greg had believed larger walls would improve his property. I believed accurate measurements protected every property. In the end, neither opinion decided what happened. The records did. The survey did. The law did. Justice never arrived with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. It arrived one verified measurement at a time, proving once again that the quietest evidence is often the most impossible to ignore.